The dust settled over the freshly turned earth, and Felicity Thompson thought her heart might have been buried 6 feet under, along with Thomas, her husband of 3 years who had caught a bullet meant for a cattle rustler's enemy. She stood at the grave marker with her hand pressed against the rough wooden cross, feeling the splinters bite into her palm as if the pain could somehow anchor her to this world when everything inside her wanted to sink into the darkness beside him. Loveland, Colorado. In the summer of 1876 was a harsh place for a widow of 24 with no family and a homestead that demanded 2 pairs of hands to survive. The preacher had spoken words that floated past her like dandelion seeds on the wind, meaningless and impossible to grasp. Her sister-in-law Constance had tried to pull her away from the gravesite, but Felicity had shaken her off with a force that surprised them both. "I am not leaving," Felicity had said, her voice raw from crying. "Not yet." So they left her there as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed obscene in their beauty when Thomas would never see another sunset. She knelt in the dirt, not caring that her black dress would be stained, and pressed her forehead against the cross. "I swear to you," she whispered, "I swear on this grave that I will go on. I do not know how, but I will not let your death be the end of me. I will find a way to keep the homestead. I will find a way to live, even if every breath feels like swallowing glass." The words felt both like a promise and a curse, binding her to a future she could not imagine wanting. She stayed until the stars emerged, silver pinpricks against the darkening blue, and then she walked back to the cabin that felt cavernous and cold despite the summer heat. The animals needed tending. The fence on the north pasture needed mending. The roof leaked when it rained. Thomas had been planning to fix it before the storm that never came, before the day he rode into town and crossed paths with violence that was not meant for him. Felicity moved through the next days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done because her body remembered the motions even when her mind drifted. She fed the chickens and collected eggs. She milked the cow whose patient brown eyes seemed to hold more sympathy than any human words could convey. She hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached. It was on the 4th day after the funeral that she discovered the fence had not just been damaged by weather, but by someone cutting the wire, and 3 of their cattle were missing. Her heart, which she had thought was too numb to feel anything new, clenched with fresh fear. They could not afford to lose any livestock. The cattle were their livelihood, the difference between survival and starvation through the coming winter. She was examining the cut wire, trying to determine which direction the cattle might have been driven when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle she had brought with her, and she turned to see a rider approaching across the grassland. The sun was behind him, turning him into a silhouette, and for one wild moment, her heart leaped with the irrational hope that somehow Thomas had returned. But as the rider drew closer, she saw this man was taller, broader in the shoulders, and he sat his horse with an easy grace that Thomas, for all his good qualities, had never quite mastered. He wore a dark hat pulled low, a dusty brown jacket, and there was a cautious set to his posture that suggested he knew he might not be welcome. He stopped his horse several yards away and touched the brim of his hat. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried clearly in the still air. "Name is Jackson Orville. I have been working cattle drives up from Texas, and I heard in town that you might be in need of a hired hand." Felicity stared at him, taking in the weathered face that spoke of years under the sun, the dark hair that needed cutting, the gray eyes that met hers directly, but without challenge. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30, and there was something steady about him that made her want to trust him, even as her practical mind warned against trusting any stranger. "I cannot pay much," she said, because the truth was she could barely pay anything at all. "Room and board would do, and whatever you can spare when you sell the cattle," Jackson said. "I am not looking to get rich. I am looking for honest work and a place to settle for a while." She should have asked more questions. She should have demanded references or ridden into town to ask if anyone knew him. But standing there with the cut fence wire in her hands and the weight of impossibility pressing down on her, She heard herself say, "The bunkhouse is behind the barn. It is not much, but it is weatherproof. I can offer 3 meals a day and whatever I can pay after we sell this year." Jackson nodded slowly. "That is fair. What is the most pressing need?" "Someone cut the fence and took 3 head of cattle, probably 2 nights ago. I need to find them if they are findable, and I need to repair what was cut and make sure it does not happen again." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a hardening around his eyes. "Rustlers? I do not know. Could be. Could be someone who thinks a widow is easy prey." "They would be wrong about that, I reckon," Jackson said, and there might have been the smallest hint of approval in his voice. "Let me see the tracks." He dismounted and walked over to where she stood, his boots crunching on the dry grass. He crouched down to examine the ground, his long fingers tracing patterns in the dust that she could not read. She found herself noticing details she had no business noticing, like the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, or how his hands looked both strong and careful at the same time. "3 horses, one of them favoring the left foreleg," he said. "They drove the cattle east, toward the foothills. Trail is a couple days old, but if they did not take them far, we might still recover them." "We?" Felicity asked. Jackson stood and looked at her directly. "You hired me to help with the cattle. This is helping with the cattle. But I will need you to come along because if we find whoever took them, they need to see that you are not backing down. A hired hand can be dismissed as someone just doing a job. The landowner standing up for what is hers sends a different message." Felicity felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the numbness that had surrounded her heart. He was right. If she let this go, if she let someone steal from her without consequence, it would be the beginning of the end for the homestead. "Give me 10 minutes to saddle my horse," she said. They rode east as the sun climbed higher, and Jackson proved to be a man of few words, but keen observation. He would stop occasionally to dismount and examine the ground, or to point out a broken branch or a hoof print pressed into softer soil. Felicity found herself watching him more than she probably should, noting the competent way he handled his horse, the alert but relaxed way he scanned the horizon. "You have done this before," she said after an hour of riding. "Tracking?" "Some," Jackson acknowledged. "I spent time scouting for wagon trains a few years back. You learn to read the land, or you do not last long." "What brought you to Colorado?" she asked, then immediately wondered if she was being too forward. But the silence between them had been comfortable, and the question felt natural. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was engaged once down in Texas. She decided she wanted a man with steadier prospects and a fancy house in town. Cannot say I blame her, but it made me want to move on to somewhere new. Heard Colorado was good cattle country, figured I would see it for myself." "I am sorry," Felicity said, and meant it. "Was for the best," Jackson said. "Better to know before the wedding than after. What about you? You are young to be widowed, if you do not mind me saying." The words should have hurt, but instead, Felicity found them almost a relief. Most people in town tiptoed around her grief, as if speaking of it might shatter her completely. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "We had 3 years together. He was killed by a stray bullet in town. Wrong place at the wrong time. It has been 10 days. I am sorry for your loss," Jackson said quietly. "No one should have to bury a spouse that young." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely, but his expression was hidden by the shadow of his hat brim. They rode on in silence after that, but it felt like an understanding had passed between them, a recognition of shared pain even if the particulars were different. It was near midday when Jackson held up his hand suddenly, signaling for her to stop. He pointed toward a narrow canyon ahead, where a thin stream cut through the rocks. "Smoke," he said. "See it? Just above those cottonwoods." Felicity squinted and saw the faint gray line rising into the blue sky. Her pulse quickened. "What do we do?" "We approach careful," Jackson said. "Let me go first. If it is your cattle, I will signal you. If it is trouble, you ride back to town and get the sheriff." "This is my land, my cattle," Felicity protested. "I will not hide while you take the risk." Jackson turned to look at her fully, and his gray eyes were serious. "Mrs. Thompson, I am not questioning your courage, but I have been in more than a few tight situations, and the smart play is to not put both of us at risk when one can scout ahead. If something happens to me, you can still get help. If something happens to both of us, your homestead is finished. That is just practical thinking." He was right, and she hated that he was right. She nodded stiffly. "How will I know if there is trouble?" "If you hear gunshots, or if I do not come back within 15 minutes, you ride hard for town." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked that it was loaded, then urged his horse forward at a slow walk. Felicity watched him disappear around the bend of the canyon, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She counted the seconds, trying to turn them into minutes, trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. The landscape was so quiet she could hear the buzz of insects, the creak of her saddle leather, the sound of her own breathing. She had counted to 700 when Jackson reappeared, leading his horse on foot. He waved for her to come forward, and relief flooded through her so strongly she felt almost dizzy. She dismounted and led her own horse toward him. "Your cattle are there," he said quietly. "3 head, like you thought, but so are 3 men, and they look like they are settling in for a meal. One of them is wearing a belt buckle I recognize from seeing in the general store, which means they are local, not drifters." Felicity felt anger burn through her, hot and sharp. "They are from Loveland? They stole from a widow knowing full well what they were doing?" "Seems like," Jackson said. "Question is, how do you want to handle this? We can ride back and get the sheriff, or we can confront them ourselves. I will back whatever you decide." She thought about it, weighing the options. Getting the sheriff was the safe choice, but it also meant these men would know they had frightened her into running for help. It meant showing weakness, and something in her, some part that had been smothering under grief and exhaustion, wanted to face them down herself. "We confront them," she said. "But we do it smart. You said 3 men?" "Yes, madam." "Then we need them to understand that we are serious, but we give them a chance to make this right before involving the law. These are my neighbors, even if they are thieves. I have to live here." Jackson nodded slowly. "That is generous of you. All right, here is what I suggest. We ride in together. Rifles visible, but not aimed. I will do most of the talking at first. Establish that you have a hand working for you who knows what he is doing. Then you make it clear these are your cattle and you are taking them back. We give them the option to apologize and walk away or face the consequences. How does that sound?" "It sounds terrifying," Felicity admitted. "But let us do it." They mounted up and rode around the bend together. The canyon opened into a small clearing where 3 horses were tied to a picket line, and 3 men sat around a small fire. One was tending a coffee pot, another was cleaning his rifle, and the third looked like he might have been sleeping against a saddle. The 3 cattle were grazing nearby, looking entirely unconcerned about their situation. All 3 men looked up as Felicity and Jackson rode in, and she saw the calculation in their eyes, the quick assessment of threat. The one cleaning his rifle was the youngest, probably not much older than 20, with the sunburned face of someone who spent more time drinking than working. The one with the coffee pot was older, maybe 40, with a thick beard and the kind of belly that spoke of too many good meals. The third, who sat up quickly from his lounging position, was somewhere in between, lean and hard-looking, with cold eyes that fixed on Felicity with an expression she did not like. "Morning," Jackson said easily, as if they were all friends who had happened to meet by chance. "Nice day for it." "For what?" the lean man asked, his hand drifting casually toward his gun belt. "For returning cattle to their rightful owner," Jackson said, and his voice was still easy, but there was steel underneath it now. "Those 3 belong to Mrs. Thompson here, and they wandered off through a cut fence. We have been tracking them all morning." "That's so," the lean man said. We found these strays and were just holding them, figuring someone would come looking. That is thoughtful of you, Felicity said, finding her voice and making it as steady as she could. But the fence was cut, not broken, and the tracks show these cattle were driven, not wandering. So let us speak plainly. You took what belongs to me, probably thinking a new widow would be too grieved or too weak to do anything about it. You were wrong. The young one had the grace to look ashamed, but the bearded one bristled. You calling us thieves? I am saying those are my cattle. They are coming back with me. And if you want to dispute that, we can ride into town and discuss it with Sheriff Morrison, Felicity said. Her voice did not shake, and she felt Jackson's steadying presence beside her like a physical thing, lending her courage. The lean man studied them both, and she could see him doing the math. 3 against 2, but 2 who were prepared and clearly not bluffing. A widow who might be angrier and braver than expected, and a hired hand who looked like he knew how to use the rifle resting across his saddle. There is no need for trouble, the lean man said finally. Like I said, we found them and we're holding them. You want them back? Take them. And the fence? Jackson asked. Someone needs to pay for the wire that was cut. The bearded man looked like he wanted to argue, but the lean one shot him a look. How much? $5, Felicity said, naming a figure that was more than the wire cost, but less than what the trouble and lost time had cost her. The lean man dug into his pocket and pulled out some coins, counting them out with obvious reluctance. He walked over and held them out to Felicity, and she had to force herself not to flinch when he came close. She took the money, meeting his eyes and refusing to look away first. We will not have any more trouble, will we? She asked. No trouble, the lean man agreed, but his smile was not friendly. Welcome to widowhood, Mrs. Thompson. It is a hard life. So I am learning, Felicity said coldly. But I am harder than I look. They gathered the cattle and drove them back toward the homestead, leaving the 3 men behind. Felicity did not relax until they were well away from the canyon, and then all at once the tension drained out of her, and she felt shaky and strange. You did well, Jackson said quietly. Standing up to them like that took courage. I felt like I was going to be sick the entire time, Felicity admitted. Courage is not the absence of fear, Jackson said. It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You did that. They drove the cattle back in silence, and by the time they reached the homestead, the sun was lowering toward the mountains and Felicity felt exhausted down to her bones. Jackson helped her pen the cattle, then set about repairing the fence while she went to start on the evening meal. She found herself making more food than she needed, old habits from cooking for Thomas reasserting themselves, and when she called Jackson in for supper, there was enough for both of them and then some. They ate at the small table in the cabin, and the presence of another person across from her was both painful and oddly comforting. You should know, Jackson said, pushing potatoes around his plate. Those men might not be the end of it. That lean one, he looked like the type to hold a grudge. What do you suggest? Felicity asked. I will keep watch at night, make sure no one comes around to cause more trouble. And we should ride into town in the next few days. Talk to the sheriff official get your report on record. That way, if anything else happens, there is documentation. You have been here less than a day, and already I owe you more than I can repay, Felicity said quietly. Jackson looked up at her, his gray eyes serious. You do not owe me anything beyond what we agreed. I took this job because I wanted work and a place to be for a while. Helping you stand up to those men, that was just the right thing to do. After the meal, Jackson excused himself to the bunkhouse, and Felicity was left alone in the cabin that felt simultaneously too empty and too full of memories. She washed the dishes and found herself thinking about Jackson Orville, about the steadiness of him, the quiet competence. It felt disloyal to Thomas to notice another man at all, let alone to notice the way Jackson's hands moved or the sound of his voice. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and told herself it was just gratitude, just relief at not being alone anymore. Nothing more than that. The next days fell into a rhythm. Jackson proved to be everything he had promised and more. He repaired the fence and then went on to fix the leaky roof, shore up the barn door that had been hanging crooked, and mend harness leather that Thomas had been meaning to get to for months. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew what needed doing and simply did it without being asked. Felicity found herself looking forward to meal times when Jackson would come in dusty and tired, and they would sit together at the table. He was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and often touched with dry humor that made her smile despite herself. He told her stories about his time on cattle drives, about sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt, about rivers that ran so fast and cold they took your breath away. She found herself telling him things too, about growing up in Pennsylvania, about meeting Thomas at a church social, and how he had courted her with wildflowers and awkward poetry, about the decision to move west, to try for something bigger and braver than the safe small life they could have had back east. "Do you regret it?" Jackson asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains. "Coming west, I mean." Felicity considered the question carefully. "I regret that Thomas died. I regret that he never got to see what this place could become. But I do not regret the choice to come here." "Does that make sense?" "It does," Jackson said. "You can grieve what was lost without wishing you had never tried." She looked at him, at his profile outlined against the fading light, and felt something shift in her chest. It was not attraction, she told herself firmly. It was just recognition of kindness, of understanding. It was just the natural human need for companionship after too many days of crushing loneliness. But when she went to bed that night, she found herself lying awake and thinking about the way Jackson had looked at her when he thought she was not watching, with an expression that was careful and gentle and perhaps a little bit sad. 2 weeks after Jackson arrived, they rode into Loveland together to make the official report to Sheriff Morrison and to pick up supplies. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses that had sprung up to serve the surrounding ranches and homesteads. The sheriff's office was a squat adobe building next to the courthouse, and Sheriff Morrison was a grizzled man in his 50s who listened to Felicity's story with a serious expression. "I know those men," he said when she finished. "The lean one is Garrett Hobbs, and he has been trouble before, but nothing we could prove. The bearded one is his cousin, and the young one is just stupid enough to follow along with whatever Garrett suggests. You did right to confront them and get your cattle back, but Mrs. Thompson, you need to be careful. Garrett does not like being shown up, especially not by a woman." "That sounds like his problem, not mine," Felicity said, more sharply than she intended. Morrison's mouth quirked in what might have been approval. "Fair enough, but watch your back is all I am saying. And you," he looked at Jackson, "you seem like you know what you are doing. Keep an eye on things." "Yes, sir," Jackson said. They left the sheriff's office and walked toward the general store, and Felicity was acutely aware of the way people looked at them. At her, the recent widow, and the tall stranger at her side. She could practically hear the gossip starting, could imagine the whispers about how quickly she had hired a man, how improper it was for her to be alone with him on the homestead. Jackson must have sensed her tension because he said quietly, "People will talk no matter what you do. You cannot live your life trying to prevent gossip." "I know," Felicity said. "But Thomas has been gone less than a month. It feels wrong for people to be thinking things about us." "Then let them think what they want," Jackson said. "You know the truth, and I know the truth. That is what matters." But the truth was getting more complicated, at least in Felicity's mind, because the truth was that she found herself watching for Jackson in the mornings, that she took extra care with her appearance before calling him for meals, that she felt a little thrill of pleasure when he smiled at her. The truth was that she was starting to feel things she had no business feeling for a man who was just her hired hand, and it had been less than a month since she buried her husband. The guilt was crushing. They were loading supplies into the wagon when a woman approached them. She was in her 30s, well-dressed, with dark hair pinned up under a fashionable hat. "Mrs. Thompson," she said warmly. I am Eleanor Worth. I wanted to extend my condolences. I lost my own husband 2 years ago, and I know how difficult this time must be. Felicity felt tears prick at her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Worth. Please call me Eleanor. And if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands, my door is always open. I live above the millinery shop. Eleanor glanced at Jackson and then back to Felicity with knowing eyes. I also want you to know that when I hired help after my husband died, there were plenty of people who had opinions about it. I learned to smile and ignore them. A woman has to survive, and survival sometimes means making choices that others do not understand. I appreciate that, Felicity said, feeling a rush of gratitude for this stranger's wisdom. Eleanor pressed her hand briefly and then moved on, but her words stayed with Felicity through the ride back to the homestead. A woman has to survive. Was that all she was doing? Surviving? Or was there something more starting to grow in the cracks of her broken heart? That night, after supper, Jackson lingered on the porch instead of heading to the bunkhouse immediately. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. When you stood at your husband's grave and swore you would go on, what did you mean? Go on to what? Felicity was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening landscape. I do not know, she admitted. In that moment, I just meant I would keep breathing, keep moving, not let the grief swallow me whole. But now I think maybe I meant something more. That I would not just survive, but actually live. That I would make something of this place, this life, even without him. She paused. Does that sound foolish? No, Jackson said softly. It sounds brave. She turned to look at him and found him already watching her. In the dim light from the cabin windows, his face was shadowed, but his eyes were clear. Can I tell you something? She asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. Anything. I feel guilty, she whispered, because I am starting to feel less sad, and that feels like betraying Thomas. He deserves to be mourned longer than a few weeks. But when you are here, when we are working together, or eating together, or just sitting like this, I feel almost happy, and that happiness feels like a sin. Jackson was quiet for so long she thought maybe she had said too much, revealed too much. But then he spoke, his voice low and careful. I think Thomas would want you to be happy. I think anyone who loved you would want that. Grief does not have a timeline, and moving forward is not the same as forgetting. How do you know? Felicity asked, and there was an edge of desperation in her voice. How do you know it is all right to feel this way? Because I know what it is to lose someone, Jackson said. Not the same way you lost Thomas, but I know what it is to grieve. And I know that life keeps going whether we are ready for it or not. We can either let it drag us along, or we can choose to walk into it. Felicity felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying, but it was different from the harsh, choking sobs of the past weeks. These tears felt almost cleansing, like a summer rain washing away dust. I do not know how to do this, she said. I do not know how to let myself live again. You do not have to know everything right now, Jackson said gently. You just have to keep going one day at a time. That is all any of us can do. He stood up then, and for a moment she thought he might reach out to her, might offer comfort in the form of a touch, but he just tipped his hat and said good night, leaving her alone on the porch with her tears and her tangled feelings. The summer deepened into August, and the work on the homestead intensified. There was hay to cut and stack for winter, fence to check and repair, cattle to move to better grazing. Jackson worked from dawn until dusk, and Felicity found herself working alongside him more often than not. She learned to swing a hammer properly, to mend fence wire without cutting herself on the barbs, to read the weather in the color of the sky at sunrise. She was stronger than she had been a month ago, both in body and in spirit. Her hands were calloused now, her skin tanned despite her best efforts to wear a bonnet. And she was sleeping better, the exhaustion of physical labor carrying her into dreamless rest instead of the nightmares that had plagued her right after Thomas died. But the more time she spent with Jackson, the more complicated her feelings became. She noticed things about him that she had no business noticing, like the way his hair curled when it got sweaty, or how he hummed sometimes while he worked. She found herself inventing reasons to work near him, to hear his voice, to catch his rare smiles. And she was almost certain he was feeling something too. She caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch, a kind of longing that he quickly shuddered away. He was careful never to touch her unless absolutely necessary, and even then he was so cautious it was almost painful. At night, lying in her empty bed, she found herself wondering what it would be like if things were different, if she were not a recent widow and he were not her hired hand. It was dangerous thinking, she knew, but her heart, which had been so frozen with grief, was beginning to thaw, and Jackson Orville was the warmth that was melting it. One hot afternoon in late August, they were working together to move a stubborn stump that was in the way of expanding the garden. They had ropes attached to it, tied to Jackson's horse, but the stump was refusing to budge. Felicity was digging around the roots with a shovel, sweating and frustrated, when the shovel hit a rock and jarred out of her hands, scraping across her palm as it fell. "Damn it," she said, then immediately looked embarrassed at her language. Jackson was beside her in an instant. "Let me see," he said, and took her hand gently in his. The scrape was not deep, but it was bleeding, dirt ground into the raw skin. "We need to clean this," he said. "Come on." He led her to the well and pumped water over her hand, his fingers careful as they cleaned away the dirt. Felicity was intensely aware of his touch, of the warmth of his hands on hers, of how close he was standing. She could see the stubble on his jaw, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his mouth was set in concentration as he examined her palm. "It is not bad," he said finally, but he did not let go of her hand. "But you should wrap it so it does not get infected." "Jackson," she said softly, and he looked up at her. Their eyes met and held, and the air between them felt charged with something electric and terrifying and wonderful. "Felicity," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and a question all at once. She was not sure which of them moved first, but suddenly his hand was cupping her face, and hers was resting on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart through the fabric of his shirt. They stood frozen like that, balanced on the edge of something irrevocable. "We should not," Felicity whispered, but she did not pull away. "I know," Jackson said. "It is too soon. People will talk. There are 100 reasons why this is a bad idea." "But?" Felicity asked, because she could hear the unspoken word hanging between them. "But I care about you," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have tried not to. I have tried to keep my distance, to just be the hired hand and nothing more. But Felicity, you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever met, and when I look at you, I see someone who is fighting every day to build a life from grief and hardship. How could I not care about that? How could I not care about you?" Felicity felt like all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "I care about you too," she said. "And I feel so guilty about it, because Thomas has been gone such a short time. What kind of wife forgets her husband so quickly?" "You have not forgotten him," Jackson said firmly. "Grief and love are not the same thing, and moving forward does not mean leaving him behind. It just means you are choosing to keep living, which is what you swore at his grave you would do. But this feels like more than just living," Felicity said. "This feels like wanting something for myself. Is that wrong?" "No," Jackson said. "It is not wrong to want to be happy. It is not wrong to want companionship and understanding, and maybe more than that. Your husband is gone, Felicity. You did not choose that, and you did not want it, but it is the truth, and you have a choice now about what kind of life you want to live going forward." Felicity closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand still on her face. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, about the future they had planned, and then she thought about standing at his grave and swearing she would go on, that she would not let his death destroy her. Going on meant living, and living meant letting herself feel things, even things that were complicated and scary and perhaps too soon. She opened her eyes and looked at Jackson. "I am terrified," she admitted. "So am I," Jackson said with a small smile. "But I think you are worth being terrified for." She laughed, a small, watery sound, and felt something inside her chest loosen and expand. "What do we do now?" "We take it slow," Jackson said. "We do not rush anything. We let this be whatever it becomes, without forcing it or apologizing for it. And we know that people might judge us, but we answer only to ourselves and to what feels right." Felicity nodded slowly. "Slow," she agreed. "But Jackson, I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. It is not just gratitude or loneliness or trying to replace what I lost. It is you, the way you are steady and kind, and how you make me feel like I can face anything. What you feel for me is nothing compared to what I feel for you," Jackson said, and then he leaned down and kissed her forehead so gently it was barely a whisper of contact. "But we have time. We will figure this out together." He stepped back then, letting her go, and the loss of his warmth was like a physical ache. But there was also relief in the space, in the acknowledgement that they did not have to rush, that they could let this unfold naturally. They went back to work on the stump, but everything felt different now. The air seemed brighter, the work less burdensome. Felicity found herself smiling for no particular reason and catching Jackson doing the same. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Jackson told her about his family in Texas, about parents who had died of fever when he was young, about a sister who had married and moved to California. Felicity told him about her own family back east, about parents who had been horrified when she announced she was marrying a farmer and moving west, about a brother she had not heard from in 2 years. They talked until the stars came out, and when Jackson finally stood to leave, he took her bandaged hand gently in his and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Felicity," he said. "Good night, Jackson," she replied, and watched him walk to the bunkhouse with her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. The next weeks were a strange kind of courtship, if it could be called that. They worked together during the day, ate meals together, talked in the evenings. But Jackson was true to his word about taking things slowly. He did not try to kiss her again, did not push for anything more than companionship and conversation. But there was a new warmth between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that colored every interaction. Felicity found herself healing in ways she had not expected. She still thought about Thomas, still missed him, but the sharp edges of grief were beginning to dull into something more bearable. She could remember the good times without immediately being swamped by sorrow. She could look forward to the future without feeling like she was betraying the past. It was in early September that trouble came again. Felicity woke in the night to the sound of cattle bawling and the acrid smell of smoke. She threw on her wrapper and ran outside to see flames licking at the hay barn, bright orange against the black night sky. "Jackson!" she screamed, and saw him already running from the bunkhouse, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders. "Get the horses out!" he shouted. "I will get water on the barn!" They worked frantically, choking on smoke, eyes streaming. Felicity led the terrified horses to the far pasture while Jackson hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well. But the fire had too much of a head start, and within an hour the barn was a blackened skeleton, most of their winter hay supply destroyed. They stood in the cold light of dawn, covered in soot and ash, looking at the ruin. "This was not an accident," Jackson said grimly, pointing to the remains of a torch at the edge of the destruction. "Someone set this." Felicity felt cold fury wash over her. "Garrett Hobbs." "Maybe," Jackson said. "Or maybe someone else. But you were right, this was deliberate." He looked at her, his face hard. "This cannot stand, Felicity. This is not about cattle or a cut fence. This is about someone trying to drive you off your land." "What do we do?" she asked, feeling suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "We go to the sheriff, we file a report, And we make it clear that you are not going anywhere, Jackson said. And then we figure out how to get through the winter with half the hay we needed. They rode into town that morning, both of them still smelling of smoke despite washing up. Sheriff Morrison took their report with a grim expression. I will talk to Hobbs, but without proof it was him, I cannot do much. Lots of people do not like the idea of a woman running a homestead alone. She is not alone, Jackson said, and there was steel in his voice. And anyone who thinks they can intimidate her is going to find out differently. Morrison looked between them, and something shifted in his expression. That how it is, then? He asked, not unkindly. Felicity lifted her chin. Mr. Orville is my hired hand and my friend. How much more it is than that is nobody's business but ours. Morrison nodded slowly. Fair enough, but you should know there is going to be talk, and talk sometimes turns into more trouble. Let them talk, Felicity said, echoing Jackson's words from weeks ago. We have work to do. They rode back to the homestead and began the grim task of assessing the damage and figuring out how to salvage what they could. The barn could be rebuilt, but that would take time and money. The hay was mostly gone, which meant they would need to buy feed through the winter or reduce their herd. Neither option was good. That evening, as they sat exhausted on the porch, Jackson said quietly, I have some money saved. It is not much, but it is enough to buy timber for the barn and some feed to supplement what we lost. Jackson, no, Felicity protested. This is not your responsibility. Is it not? He asked, looking at her directly. Because it seems to me that somewhere along the way, your problems became our problems. This homestead, your cattle, your fight to keep going, it all matters to me because you matter to me. Felicity felt tears well up. You have already given me so much. Your time, your labor, your protection. I cannot ask you to give your savings too. You are not asking, Jackson said. I am offering. And Felicity, I need you to understand something. I am not planning to leave when the season ends. I am not planning to move on come spring. If you will have me, I want to stay. Not just as your hired hand, but as your partner in this life you are building. Her breath caught. What are you saying? Jackson took her hand, holding it gently between both of his. I am saying that I love you. I know it is fast, and I know there are people who will judge it, but I cannot help how I feel. You asked me once how you could let yourself live again, and I think the answer is that you do it by choosing things that make you want to keep living. You make me want to keep living too, Felicity. You make me want to build something lasting and real. I love you too, Felicity whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. I did not think I could feel this way again. Not so soon. But you have shown me that life keeps going, that there is still joy to be found even after terrible loss. You helped me find a reason to go on, Jackson. Not just to survive, but to actually live. Jackson pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that as the sun set and the stars emerged, two people who had found each other in the midst of grief and hardship and decided to choose hope instead of despair. What will people say? Felicity asked after a while. They will say plenty, Jackson acknowledged. They will say it is too soon, that it is improper, that you did not mourn long enough. But Felicity, those people are not living your life. They did not stand beside your husband's grave and swear to keep going. They do not know what it costs you every day to get up and face the world without him, and they do not get to decide when or how you heal. You are right, Felicity said, but I think we should wait just a bit longer before we make any formal declarations, not because I am ashamed, but because I want to do this right. I want to honor Thomas's memory while still moving forward with you. We will wait as long as you need, Jackson said. I am not going anywhere. They rebuilt the barn over the next weeks, with Jackson doing most of the heavy work and Felicity helping where she could. Neighbors who had been standoffish began to warm up after seeing how hard they worked, and a few even offered to help with the raising of the frame. Eleanor Worth came out from town with food and encouragement and became a friend that Felicity treasured. It was Eleanor who suggested one afternoon in late September that Felicity might want to visit Thomas's grave and talk to him about what was happening. I know it sounds strange, Eleanor said, but when I fell in love again after my husband died, I went to his grave and told him about it. I needed him to know that I would always love what we had, but that I was choosing to keep living. It brought me peace. So Felicity went, on a crisp autumn afternoon, with leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods, and stood beside the wooden cross that marked Thomas's resting place. She had not been back since the day of his funeral, and part of her was afraid of what she might feel. But standing there, she felt mostly just sad and grateful. Sad for the life they had not gotten to live together, and grateful for the time they had shared. I am going to marry him, she said aloud, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. Jackson Orville, the cowboy who came looking for work and ended up saving me. I know it has only been 4 months, and people will say I did not mourn you properly. But Thomas, you knew me. You knew I could not live half a life. And this is not forgetting you. This is choosing to keep going, the way I swore I would. She paused, listening to the wind in the trees. I will always love you. What we had was real and good, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. But I am also going to love him, because he helped me find a reason to go on when I thought there was no reason left. He is a good man, Thomas. You would have liked him. She stayed a bit longer, pulling weeds from around the grave marker and straightening the faded flowers someone had left. And when she walked away, she felt lighter somehow, as if Thomas himself had given her permission to move forward. She found Jackson mending fence in the north pasture, and she walked straight up to him and said, "Marry me." He looked up, startled, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "Is that a proposal, Mrs. Thompson?" "It is," she said. "I know traditionally the man asks, but I am not feeling particularly traditional right now. I love you, Jackson Orville. I want to build a life with you, to run this homestead together, to face whatever comes as partners. So what do you say?" Jackson set down his tools and pulled her into his arms, lifting her clean off her feet. "I say yes," he said, and then he kissed her, really kissed her for the first time, and it felt like coming home and starting a new journey all at once. They decided to marry in November after the fall work was done, but before winter set in hard. It was a small ceremony in the church in Loveland, with Eleanor Worth as witness and a handful of friends from neighboring homesteads. Felicity wore a simple blue dress instead of white, because white felt wrong when she was a widow remarrying, and she carried wildflowers that Jackson had picked that morning. There was talk, of course. Some people said it was shameful how quickly she had moved on, how disrespectful to Thomas's memory. But there were others who understood, who had lived through loss themselves and knew that healing did not follow a prescribed timeline. Standing at the altar and looking into Jackson's eyes, Felicity felt more certain than she had about anything since Thomas died. This was right. This was the life she was choosing, and she was choosing it with full knowledge of what it meant. "I love you," Jackson said as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me." "You already are," Felicity said. "You saved me, Jackson. Not just from practical problems, but from the darkness that wanted to swallow me whole. You gave me a reason to go on." "You saved yourself," Jackson corrected gently. "You swore at your husband's grave that you would keep going, and you kept that promise. I just walked beside you while you did." They honeymooned at the homestead because there was too much work to go anywhere, and because home was where they both wanted to be. Jackson moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse into the cabin, and they spent the winter months making it truly theirs, building a life together in the space where Felicity had grieved alone. It was not always easy. There were moments when Felicity felt guilty for being happy, when she would find something of Thomas's and be struck by fresh grief. But Jackson was patient and understanding, never jealous of the love she had lost, always supportive of her need to remember and honor it. And there were moments of pure joy, like the first snowfall when they stood on the porch wrapped in blankets and watched the world turn white. Or Christmas morning when Jackson gave her a hand-carved jewelry box he had been working on in secret. Or the night in January when they sat by the fire and made plans for spring, for expanding the herd and maybe planting an orchard. Winter turned to spring, and with the warming weather came new beginnings. The cattle thrived, the land greened, and Felicity discovered she was pregnant. The joy and terror of it hit her simultaneously. A child, a new life, a future she had not let herself imagine. "Are you happy?" Jackson asked, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I am terrified," Felicity admitted. "But yes, I am happy. This feels like a new chapter, like everything we have been building together is becoming real in a way I can touch." "We will do this together," Jackson promised, "just like everything else." The baby was born in October of 1877, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs and his father's gray eyes. They named him Thomas Jackson Orville, honoring both the past and the present. Holding her son in her arms, Felicity thought about the day she had stood at Thomas Thompson's grave and sworn she would go on. She had kept that promise, but she had done more than just survive. She had built a new life, found new love, and created new hope. The cowboy who had come looking for work had helped her find a reason not just to go on, but to embrace life with both hands. Jackson sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, looking down at their son with wonder. "He is perfect," Jackson said softly. "He is our future," Felicity said. "Ours in this lands. Everything we have fought for, everything we have built, it is all for him now." Over the next years, the homestead flourished. They expanded the herd, added chickens and pigs, and planted the orchard they had dreamed about. Two more children came, a daughter named Grace in 1879 and another son named Samuel in 1881. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the once struggling homestead became one of the most productive in the area. Felicity never forgot Thomas, and she taught her children about the man whose name their oldest brother carried. But she also taught them about courage, about resilience, about the importance of choosing to live even when life deals you terrible losses. Jackson proved to be exactly the partner she needed, strong when she needed strength, gentle when she needed comfort, always steady and always there. Together they built something lasting, something that would outlive them both. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they rode out to the spot where the hay barn had burned, now rebuilt and full of sweet-smelling hay for the winter. They sat on their horses and looked out over the land they had tamed together. "Do you ever regret it?" Felicity asked. "Taking that job 10 years ago, tying yourself to a grieving widow and her failing homestead?" Jackson reached over and took her hand. "Not for one single moment. You were the best decision I ever made, Felicity. And this life we have built, it is more than I ever dreamed of having." "I swore I would go on," Felicity said, standing at Thomas's grave all those years ago. "But I did not know then what going on would actually mean. I did not know it would mean finding you, loving you, building all of this. I thought going on meant enduring. I did not know it could mean thriving." "You taught me something too," Jackson said. "You taught me that it is never too late to find home, to find love, to find purpose. I was drifting when I came here, and you gave me a reason to put down roots." They rode back to the house as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Their children ran out to meet them. Thomas, now a lanky boy of 10, helping his father with the horses, Grace at 7, already showing signs of her mother's determination, and Samuel at 6, still young enough to need to be swung up into his father's arms. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jackson and Felicity sat on the porch, as they had done countless times before. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they watched the stars emerge one by one. Tell me a story, Felicity said, a ritual they had developed over the years. What kind of story? Jackson asked, though he already knew. Tell me the story of how a grieving widow and a drifting cowboy built a life together against all odds, Felicity said, smiling. So Jackson told her the story, embellishing the parts that needed embellishing, making her laugh at his descriptions of how terrified he had been of her that first day, how sure he was that she would send him away. He told her about falling in love with her strength before he fell in love with her beauty, about the moment he knew he would never leave, about the day he first dared to hope she might feel the same. And Felicity listened, even though she knew the story by heart, because it was their story. It was the story of how she had sworn to go on, and how he had helped her find not just a reason to go on, but a reason to live fully and completely. It was a story of loss and love, of grief and healing, of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and decided to build something beautiful together. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows, as all years do. There were hard winters and good harvests, sick cattle and healthy foals, lean times and prosperous ones. But through it all, Felicity and Jackson faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing season. When Thomas turned 18, he took over much of the day-to-day running of the homestead, showing a natural talent for ranching that made both his parents proud. Grace became a teacher in Loveland, beloved by her students and known for her fierce intelligence and kind heart. Samuel showed an interest in medicine and eventually went to study in Denver, returning to set up a practice in their growing town. Felicity and Jackson grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their spirits still strong. They celebrated their 20th anniversary, then their 30th, then their 40th. And through all those years, Felicity never forgot the promise she made at Thomas Thompson's grave, the promise that had set her on the path to this life. On a warm spring afternoon in 1916, Felicity Thompson Orville sat on the porch of the homestead she had built with two different men, both of whom she had loved completely. Jackson sat beside her, his hand in hers, their fingers intertwined as naturally as breathing. "I have been thinking," Felicity said, "about that day you rode up to the fence line and asked for work. What would have happened if I had said no?" "You would have figured it out," Jackson said without hesitation. "You were already figuring it out. You did not need me to save you, Felicity. You just needed a partner to stand beside you." "Maybe," Felicity said, "but I am grateful every day that you were the one who showed up, that you were the one who helped me see that going on did not mean going on alone." Their grandchildren played in the yard, children of children, the future they had created spreading out like the roots of a strong tree. The homestead that had once been a desperate struggle was now a thriving ranch, passed down through generations, built on the foundation of two people who refused to give up. As the sun set over the mountains one more time, painting the sky in colors that never got old, no matter how many times you saw them, Felicity leaned into Jackson's warmth and thought about the long journey from that grave marker to this porch. She thought about grief and healing, about the courage it takes to let yourself love again after losing everything, about the grace of second chances. She had sworn she would go on, standing in the dust and darkness of fresh loss. She had kept that promise. But more than that, she had learned that going on could mean going towards something beautiful, something worth fighting for, something that made every hard day and every sacrifice worthwhile. The cowboy had helped her find a reason to go, yes. But more than that, he had helped her find a reason to stay, to build, to love, to live. And in doing so, they had created not just a life together, but a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. As the stars began to emerge and the night birds started their evening songs, Felicity squeezed Jackson's hand and felt him squeeze back. No words were needed. After 40 years together, they could communicate entire conversations in a touch. The screen door opened and Thomas came out, now a man of nearly 40 with his own children. "Mother, Father, dinner is ready." "We will be right there," Felicity said, and watched her son go back inside with a smile. "Ready?" Jackson asked. "Always," Felicity replied, and together they stood, moving a bit slower than they once had, but still moving, still going on, still choosing each day to live fully and love deeply. They walked inside to join their family, to share a meal and stories and laughter, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a promise well kept. And if sometimes Felicity's thoughts drifted to a young farmer who had died too soon, to the love she had lost before she found the love she would keep, well, that was all right too. Hearts were big enough to hold more than one love, more than one story, more than one version of happiness. The Wild West that had once been harsh and unforgiving had been tamed by people like them, by settlers and ranchers and families who refused to give up despite the odds. And in the process of taming it, they had built something lasting, something that would outlive the hardships and the heartbreak and become part of the foundation on which future generations would stand. That night, lying in bed with Jackson's arm around her, Felicity thought once more about that day at the grave. She had sworn she would go on, and she had, but she had done so much more than that. She had gone on to love again, to build again, to hope again. She had gone on to create a family and a legacy that honored both the man she lost and the man she found. And in the end, that was what going on meant. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just enduring, but embracing. Not just existing, but living with every fiber of your being, holding nothing back, choosing joy even when sorrow tried to claim you. The cowboy had helped her find the way, but she had walked the path herself, and what a beautiful path it had been.